Hi everybody. So in this video I want to transition us from our first unit focusing on Plato's Phaedo to our second unit focusing on Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. Let's start by reminding ourselves of some of the things we talked about in Unit 1. In Plato's Phaedo, the main character Socrates argued that philosophers, and by that he means lovers of wisdom, he argued that philosophers should look forward to death. This belief puzzled his friends at first, so Socrates offered his main argument for that conclusion. After presenting his main argument, his friends' doubts centered around this question of whether the human soul actually can survive the death of the body. His friends agreed that if that is true, then the rest of his argument was sound, but they weren't sure about that idea. And so Socrates spent the rest of the dialogue offering arguments to show that the soul can and does continue to exist after death. Now, his arguments were enough to satisfy him and his friends. Probably not everybody in this class was equally convinced. And one thing that you probably noticed is that in this whole discussion, Socrates and his friends never took up the question of whether human beings do have a soul. Now, in that time and context, Socrates and his friends basically took for granted that human beings do have souls. That's why they didn't look for reasons to believe that. But for many people since then, that's a question that needs to be taken seriously. A question that needs to be answered before we can go on to talk about whether the soul can survive the death of the body. That question of whether human beings actually have an immaterial soul is part of what we'll take up in the Unit 2. It's not the only topic we'll talk about there, but that will help to provide the connection between Unit 1 and Unit 2. So now I'll say just a little bit by way of transition. In moving from Unit 1 to Unit 2, we're jumping a gap of about 2,000 years. Now, an awful lot of philosophy took place in that 2,000 years, but this is just what we're focusing on for this course. So we learned about Socrates and his student Plato, who founded the academy in Athens and began to spread some of Socrates' ideas and developed many of his own philosophical ideas. Plato's most famous student was the philosopher Aristotle. And Aristotle in particular, his writings had a huge influence on philosophy and on culture and thought in lots of different areas throughout Europe over the next 2,000 years. We're going to fast forward through that period to arrive here at the 16th and 17th century. And these are some of the names you might be familiar with from this time period, which is often referred to as the scientific revolution. Copernicus, Bacon, Kepler, and Galileo. This was a very exciting time in history, very controversial time, when a lot of older ideas, traditional ideas, were being overturned, challenged, and set aside in many cases. And it's in this context that we find the author of our next text, René Descartes. So, René Descartes, and it is Descartes, both S's are silent, it's not Descartes. Descartes was born in France, he eventually died in Sweden. He was a famous philosopher, but also a scientist and a mathematician. In fact, in any of your math classes, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, anytime you've ever been asked to plot a line on a graph with an x and a y axis, and I know that brings up unhappy memories for many people. Anytime you've been asked to do that, you have Descartes to blame for that, because he was the inventor of the Cartesian coordinate system. That's what that method of graphing is known as, the Cartesian coordinate system, after René Descartes. So Descartes made these contributions to science and mathematics, but we're going to focus on what he did in philosophy. And what he did in philosophy was in many ways revolutionary. So Descartes was living during this time when a lot of change was happening. Old ideas were being exchanged for new ones. What was revolutionary about Descartes is that he didn't just accept the new ideas in place of the old ones. He was thoughtful enough to recognize that the new ideas that he was accepting after another 100, 200, 300 years might turn out to be false as well. It's very easy for us to fall into this attitude. We tend to favor what is going on in the present over what happened in the past. We look at outdated ideas, we think that they're silly, but the stuff that's current, we take that seriously. But Descartes recognized that the present becomes the past, and future generations, in all likelihood, will look back at our ideas and think that they're silly. And this was troubling for Descartes, and I think it's important for all of us to consider this. Descartes, like Socrates before him, recognized the importance and value of knowledge. When it comes to running our lives, making big decisions, we want to have knowledge. If you're going to invest money in a company as an individual or maybe as part of a business, you want to know as much about that company as you can. If you're going to buy a piece of property, probably you should know something about the land, what you're getting into before you sign on the dotted line. If you're involved in any kind of strategy, if you're in the military and deciding whether or not to send in troops or where to locate resources, you want to know about the situation before you make your decisions. If you're going in for a medical procedure, surgery, you hope that the doctor knows what she or he is doing. You don't want the doctor to be guessing. You don't want the doctor to be 50% sure or even 90% sure about what they're doing. You want them to know. So knowledge is really important in our lives, really important for making decisions. We want to have as much knowledge as we can. But then we run up against that hard truth that knowledge is not always easy to come by. And sometimes the things we think we know turn out to be false. So Descartes lived during this time when a lot of people were recognizing that old ideas that people thought were knowledge, people thought were true, were not. And they were adopting new ideas instead. But Descartes was worried, are these new ideas any closer to knowledge, any closer to truth? Or are we just going to find out later that the ideas we're adopting now are also false, also only seem to be true or seem to be knowledge? So what Descartes set out to do was to set a solid foundation for knowledge. He didn't want to keep on playing this game of just believing the new thing and waiting to find out in later whether it was true or false. He wanted to at least try to find those things that he could know with absolute certainty. And even if we don't think that he succeeded at the end of the day, that's something that you'll have to consider. His exploration is really helpful for getting us to think about our knowledge, our beliefs, our ideas. Now, it'd be good to take a moment to reflect on the things that I've said so far. I hope that you can get some sense of why the question Descartes is asking is important and worthwhile for us to consider. Part of why it is so important for us to be able to understand the motivations of the philosophers we're reading is that many philosophical arguments do end up sounding strange. They're complicated, as we've said before. They're abstract. They're difficult to think about. And if you don't understand the author's motivation, then it's really hard to wrap our heads around the things they're talking about. We'll read about some pretty unusual things in the Meditations, and it'd be real easy to think, why is Descartes even asking this question? This seems so bizarre. This seems so strange. And what you've got to come back to is the basic motivations for Descartes' project. He recognizes that knowledge is important and valuable, and he doesn't just want to keep on playing this game of rejecting the old ideas, accepting the new, only to reject them later and accept something new, and so on and so forth. Now, Descartes' project is extremely broad and sweeping in scope. The idea of setting a new foundation for knowledge, and that basically covers everything. But it's also the case that Descartes is particularly concerned with a few key issues. And so it'd be good for us to highlight those now. So here I'll quote from Descartes' dedicatory letter at the beginning of the Meditations. This is margin numbers 1 and 2. So notice, as with Plato's Phaedo, I'm going to be using the margin numbers to pick out what part of the text we're focusing on. So in the beginning of his dedicatory letter, the sort of preface to this work, he says, I have always thought that two issues, namely God and the soul, are chief among those that ought to be demonstrated with the aid of philosophy rather than theology. For although it suffices for us believers to believe by faith that the human soul does not die with the body and that God exists, certainly no unbelievers seem capable of being persuaded of any religion or even of almost any more virtue until these two are first proven to them by natural reason. So Descartes was religious and he was writing for a religious community. And you can get hints of the critical tone toward non-believers there at the end. We'll basically set that aside. The main thing we want to notice is that Descartes wants to show that God exists and that human beings have an immortal soul using reason. He acknowledges that many of his fellow believers already believe these things on the basis of faith, perhaps on the basis of the teachings of the church, but he wants to try to provide evidence for these things that is independent of faith or the religious teachings. The idea being he wants to try to present evidence that would be convincing to any rational person. This is Descartes' project then. To provide evidence and arguments to show that God exists and that human beings have an immortal soul. And again, remember the connection between that and what we've been looking at in the Phaedo. He wants to provide arguments that would be convincing to anybody. And he's also engaged in this larger project of trying to set knowledge on a new solid foundation. That's what he's going to try to accomplish through the following 6 meditations. Now, a word about this idea of meditations. So Descartes is going to lead us through a kind of journey. At one point, he describes how he took time away from distractions when he could be alone by himself in the quiet so that he could think carefully through these problems. And really what he wants to do is he wants to lead us through that same process. So he's not just writing an essay where he tells us all of what he believes. Rather, he's trying to guide us through a process where he thinks we will discover the same things that he discovered if we will think carefully in the way that he thought carefully. And he's going to lead us through that process. So that's why these are meditations. And as you read, do try to think through the different exercises that he leads us through, the different thought experiments. Now let's go ahead and look at Descartes' methodology. So what approach is he going to take to this project of establishing a new foundation for knowledge? We'll start by looking at the opening of the meditations, the first meditation concerning those things that can be called into doubt. And this is what Descartes says at the beginning of that. Several years have now passed since I first realized how numerous were the false opinions that in my youth I had taken to be true, and thus how doubtful were all those beliefs that I had subsequently built upon them. And thus I realized that once in my life I had to raze everything to the ground and begin again from the original foundation. So Descartes really did take seriously this sort of picture, this metaphor of knowledge as a building where you start by laying the foundation and then build on that foundation. And he's recognized that the foundation is unstable or not sound, and that makes everything that was built on that questionable or doubtable. So his desire is to set up a new foundation, and to do that, the first step involves clearing away the old one. This is what's come to be known as Descartes' method of doubt. And the idea is he wants to start by refraining from assenting to any belief or claim that is not certain. Anything that possibly can be doubted, he wants to doubt, because that will guard him against believing anything that could possibly turn out to be false. Now, it's important to keep in mind Descartes' goal. Descartes does not want to end by doubting everything. No, he wants to end by knowing lots of things. It's just that the first step involves this radical kind of doubt. This is important to keep in mind. Some people, when they hear about Descartes, they get this idea, oh, Descartes was this guy who doubted everything, who believed nothing. But no, that was just the first step in this process. That's just the focus of meditation one. But then what you'll see is that once he's cleared that foundation in meditations 2 through 6, he will go on to rebuild that foundation. And by the end of the meditations, he thinks that he has established those things that we can know with certainty. Going back to the preface, he actually makes the remark, although the utility of so extensive a doubt is not readily apparent, he recognizes it's not obvious that doubting everything would be a useful step. Nevertheless, he says, its greatest utility lies in freeing us of all prejudices, in preparing the easiest way for us to withdraw the mind from the senses, and finally, in making it impossible for us to doubt any further those things that we later discover to be true. Now, there will be a separate note sheet on Meditation 1 and Descartes' method of doubt, but I want to say some things about the big picture here. Because, again, it's easy to get distracted by the bizarreness of some of Descartes' ideas. So, as he sets about this project of doubting everything that can possibly be doubted, he'll consider some pretty bizarre ideas, like the idea that maybe everything we experience is just a dream, or just an illusion created by an all-powerful demon. And again, if we're not careful, we might just think, well, that's a crazy idea, why should I even consider it? We ignore it and move on. But we want to remember that there is a point to what Descartes is doing here. At the end of the day, he doesn't think we're just dreaming. He doesn't think that we are the victims of some remarkable illusion. But he also doesn't want us to believe these things just because that's what we're used to. Remember, believing something just because it seems obvious to you isn't a way of showing that your beliefs are definitely true. And by pointing out these possibilities that we might be dreaming or we might be deceived by an all-powerful demon, he's pointing out how many of our beliefs are basically just assumptions we make. And actually, as our technology, for instance, has gotten better in the recent decades, I think that we can actually motivate Descartes' concerns in some really compelling ways. So it's one thing for Descartes 300 years ago to say, hey, maybe all our experience is one giant illusion. But today we live in a world where virtual reality, computer simulation, computer modeling is getting so good that in some cases it really is hard for us to distinguish between what is real and what is not. And so we may be in an even better position to appreciate the force of Descartes' points. Here's one example to kind of help us with this. So on the screen, I've got a cursor. And now I'm going to click and move the cursor to the left hand of the screen. So you all saw the cursor move from the right hand to the left hand side of the screen. But now notice the cursor did not actually move. In fact, there is no cursor that moved across this screen. What do I mean by that? Well, depending on what screen you're viewing this on, the technology might be a little different, but basically this screen is made up of pixels, of a whole bunch of little lights, something like this. This is much lower resolution. And when the cursor appears to move from the right-hand side of the screen to the left, that's actually just one set of pixels going off and another set of pixels going on, that going off and on and off and on. And if you do that fast enough, notice it gives the illusion that there is a single object that's moving across the screen. But of course, there isn't really. Now, this kind of illusion isn't that big a deal, but it does point out a basic way in which our senses can be fooled, can be tricked. This is what happens with movies. Maybe it's a little easier to think about before this time of digital projection. You used to have real film, which was just a sequence of still images. And when you run the still images fast enough before the viewer, it looks like that's a person walking, talking, moving across the screen, when really it's just a bunch of individual pictures in rapid succession. Now, when we notice this about our senses, this opens up room for a question like, how do we know that our ordinary day-to-day experience is not illusory in the same way that the images on our screen are? Now, for many people, it's tempting to say, well, it's just obvious. Well, that's just a silly question to ask. But notice, is that reaction describing a well thought out, well argued, well reasoned position? Or are we just buying into what seems obvious to us? Here's another funny illustration of this idea. Comic strip, Calvin and Hobbes by Bill Watterson from some years back. Calvin and his stuffed tiger Hobbes are at the breakfast table. Calvin says, "Want to see something weird? Watch, you put bread in the slot and push down this lever. Then in a few minutes, toast pops up." Hobbes looks into the toaster. "Wow, where does the bread go? Beats me, isn't that weird?" Now we laugh. This obviously seems silly to us. We recognize that the bread and the toast are the same. It's not that the bread went into the box and something else came out. No, the bread was toasted. The two things are the same. But it's worth asking this question, especially if we're in this critical thinking frame of mind. How do we know that the bread and the toast are the same? And you might think, well, the obvious answer is you can watch the bread as it becomes toasted. But just a moment ago, you watched the cursor move from the right-hand side of the screen to the left-hand side of the screen. And actually, it wasn't an object, the cursor moving across. It was one picture of a cursor being replaced by another picture of a cursor being replaced by another picture of a cursor. So at the very least, it seems we need to admit that it's not so easy to give argument or reasons for these familiar beliefs that we have. Now, what's the point here? Again, does Descartes want us to doubt everything, to doubt that bread and toast are the same thing? No, he doesn't. But he does want to start at the beginning of the meditations by getting us to think carefully about how much evidence really does support most of the beliefs that we have. Again, it's very easy for us to look at some of the beliefs that other people have, some beliefs that people had in the past, and say, oh, those beliefs are silly. I'm a critical thinker, I've thought for myself, and on the basis of that, I have these much more sophisticated, much better beliefs. But Descartes wants to ask us, wait a minute, are we really that much better at critical thinking? Are we really that much more careful about our reasoning? What would it look like if we were really careful about our reasoning? Well, we wouldn't allow assumptions to come in at all. When we see a piece of white bread go into the toaster and a piece of dark bread come out, we would not assume that they are the same thing. And even if we saw it change before our eyes, we wouldn't assume that they are the same things. And these cases of optical illusions, the way that screens and movies work, actually give us more reason to think that, hey, we could be deceived about these things. How many of us have ever actually run any of the scientific experiments that we read about in textbooks? How many of us have actually looked through a telescope and seen all the things about the solar system that we are told about? How many of us have actually made the observations and done the calculations? Few, if any. And Descartes is making this point by using these extreme kinds of cases, but the point is one that it's worthwhile for us to consider. All right, so I'll wrap up by just saying a little bit about the different meditations to give you an idea of what's coming ahead. So, meditation one is where Descartes tries to knock down all of the beliefs he has that can possibly be doubted. And again, he wants you to do the same thing. Again, these are meditations. He wants you to be engaged in this process. So think through the different exercises he takes you through to kind of get to this place where you recognize how many of your beliefs can possibly be doubted. Again, that's only the first step. In meditation two, Descartes is going to start to rebuild the structure of his knowledge. He's doubted everything that can possibly be doubted, and he's wondering, is there anything left? Is there anything that I can know with absolute certainty? And in meditation two, he will spell out 2 or 3 different beliefs that he thinks he can know with absolute certainty. Now, in meditation three, Descartes will offer an argument for God's existence. Now, that's a move that might strike many people as surprising, but this will be explained more in the note sheets. For many people, the existence of God is something that we take to be far less certain than our beliefs about our senses and the physical world. Physical objects seem to be very concrete and real. God seems to be far away, distant, remote. But Descartes actually thinks that we can be more certain about the existence of God than we can be about the composition of the material world around us. And Descartes actually thinks that the existence of God is an important foundation for the possibility of knowledge. If God doesn't exist, he thinks, then the trustworthiness of our senses is called into question. On the other hand, if God does exist, then he thinks we have good reason for trusting our senses, because God created our senses. In meditation 4, Descartes will look more at this question of why we come to have false beliefs. Now, this question is important in many different ways. So, on the one hand, Descartes has just finished arguing that God exists, that God created our senses, but he's also concerned that if God is good, as is widely believed, then why would God create human beings with senses that can be fooled, deceived, or that are fallible? So that's one reason he wants to look at this. But then another reason is that it's just helpful to know why we make mistakes. If we understand the causes of our mistakes, the causes of our false beliefs, then we can make plans to avoid making those kinds of mistakes. And that's really helpful for securing knowledge. We're going to skip over meditation 5, and in meditation 6, we will get to the existence of the physical world. So Descartes will try to show that we aren't all living in a dream or a massive computer simulation or other kind of illusion. And then he's also going to try to show that human beings have a soul that is distinct from the body. So the bit about the soul really doesn't get finished until the very end of the meditations, but Descartes thinks that all of the other steps provide an essential foundation, that without those things, we can't know about the soul for sure. With all of those other things in place, we can be confident, even certain, that the human soul does exist. So that's where we're going to go over this next week. Check out the readings and the posted notes. Make sure to post on the discussion boards, and if you have any questions, do let me know.